Okay, so what we were talking about yesterday is whether the mitzvah of Maser Ksafim is specifically for, when we talk about charity, does it mean tzedakah for aniyim, or can it be used for other mitzvahs as well, when I tithe my money? And I've gotten this question many times over the years, where a person asks, can I use my Maser for other things other than tzedakah per se? Okay, and the Chassam Sofer seems to say that yes, you could. It's not reserved exclusively for the poor. It's not like Meiser Ani, where you're taking 10% and giving it specifically to poor people. And and one of the things he had talked about is a person had died and he had left over a library that he had purchased with his Meiser Ksafim, and the custodians of the estate, the trustees of the estate, wanted to sell off the Sfarim in the library to provide it for the heirs because they argued that it wasn't used appropriately, it wasn't used properly. And the Chassam Sofer says that he disagreed. It was used within the purview of the decedent. Hooray! So that brings us to this. Shalafi Chassam Sofer nechleku haposkim beifrish meiser bistam. He says, so the Chassam Sofer seems to be of the opinion that there's a machlokes when a person sets aside a tithe, of his annual income. Lefia Shulchan Aruch Maharil de Kavase Pasuk Harama Havi le'aniyim davka. According to the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber, and the Ramah, it seems that it's really supposed to go only to the poor. But according to the Shach, who quotes the Maharam, it does not have to go specifically to the poor. Ulam betaz muchrach she'enu sober kachsam sofer dinakat shegam Maharam lo hiter laseis l'shar mitzvah rak shemagia mizeh hanoah la'aniyim. And the Taz also is more stringent, and he seems to say that even the Maharam would hold that there must be some benefit to the poor from your meiser money. Ba'ayin b'shut Imrei Yosher, and I refer you to more about that if you want to do more research in that sefer. V'hinei b'shut shvus Yaakov la'achar shekosav she'en chiyuv klal laseis meiser ksafim. Now remember, we learned in the previous responsum, is there even a thing? Is there even such a mandate to give a tenth of your income? And even though we had seen from the Shulchan Aruch that it seems that this is a correct practice midrabanan, and the Aruch HaShulchan had said that it is a rabbinic law, but the Shvus Yaakov says that no, there is no such mandate to give a tenth of your income. Isek v'zel l'shono, achein b'makom shenitpashet haminhag o mi sherotzeh la'achmir al atzmo v'noheg la'afrish meiser. But he says, in a place where that's become the prevailing minhag, or if a person wishes to be machmir on himself, and he has already started that practice of tithing, vaday kavanaso sheyehelo din meiser ani gamor, then we can assume that he wants that tithe, that 10% or that 20%, to be for the poor. Ulahachi pasuk Ramah. And it's for that reason that the Ramah paskins like the Maharil, de'ein lasos mimaiser dvar mitzvah, kegoneros lebeitz hakneses o shar mitzvahs. And that's why the Ramah is of the opinion that you should only use that money for the poor and not use it for, let's say, accoutrements for the synagogue. If you wanted to buy, let's say, the annual, right? They used to have, someone would underwrite Yayin Lakidush Vener Lahavdala. That would be my donation for the year, for the shul. So the Ramah is of the opinion that you shouldn't use that from your meiser money. Rakitain la'aniyim, v'chein pirush b'tshuvas beresheva, ve'efshir degam din neder lidvar mitzvah nagabo lios ledin meiser ani gomer ad kam l'shon. And the Shvus Yaakov therefore is also of the opinion that even though there's no obligation to give a tenth, but once a person has committed himself to do it, we assume that it's for the purpose specifically of the poor. Anias daiti muchrach lamomar shemasha kosav shemishi hifresh meiser bistam havi laniyim davka umishum shenit pashet haminhag latet laniyim davka. It seems that that's only because that the prevailing custom has been in that place to give to 10% to the poor. And of course, a lot of it will depend upon the needs of the community. So he says, Ulam b'birkei Yosef kasab, sheyesh lodun b'divrei hashvus Yaakov hanal v'lo bir kavanaso. The Birkei Yosef says this Shvus Yaakov really requires further analysis because he's not sure where he got this from, that tzedakah is supposed to go to the poor. Al kol panim imasha kasav Shvus Yaakov vaday kavanaso near the toloi b'kavanaso. But it seems, based on the Shvus Yaakov's language, that it really all depends on the intent of the donor when he committed himself to take the tithe. If he says, and therefore the Chassam Sofer, who's already, who's quite authoritative, who says that you could use your meiser for one of two reasons, one for the poor and one for other mitzvot. Then it would seem that, you'd have to really go back and ask the individual donor, what did you have in mind when you committed yourself to take 10% of your income and give it for tzedakah? Did you have in mind that it would specifically be for the poor? Or did you think that you could use it to pay off your shul membership, your kids' tuition, etc., etc., etc.? Uvizmanenu shenagu lasis gam lishar mitzvot, yitachen shebistam kavanaso gam ken lishar mitzvot. He says, nowadays, the minhag has changed. Nowadays, people generally understand that the purpose of their meiser is for all mitzvahs that have to do to charitable, organizations, and not just for the poor. And that, therefore, it could be that that's really the assessment of people's intent when they commit themselves. Ulam lefi hataz hanal shecholik alach sam sofer ein zetoli bekavana. But that's also not, there's no consensus, because there are certainly people like the Taz who seem to say that it's not dependent upon custom, but rather dependent upon just that this is the law, that it has the status of Meiser Ani, and therefore has to go to the poor. Ulagabe, mishanag la'aser et rivachav, v'natan kol hazman la'aniyim, so let's say a person up until now was tithing 10% of his profits and giving it exclusively to the poor, and now he wishes to change his patterns, his donation patterns, and he'd like to give some of it, let's say, to Magen David Adom, and would like to give some of it to Chai Lifeline or whatever. Uveshut chasam sofer kosav v'zelashona. Hachanami mekevin shehine gimel pa'amim lahafrish meiser me'revach shelo letito laniyim shuv kol ma sheyafrish meiser hava memelu laniyim v'lav kol kamini liknot mimenu near lebeit hakneset ad kam lashona. The Chassam Sofer himself says, even though he's of the opinion that you could use your meiser money for other mitzvot, he nevertheless maintains that if you've already established a pattern of only giving it to the poor, you're not allowed to change. So you would not be allowed to change. I suppose a person might be able to get a Hatoras Nadarim, but until you get that, according to the Chassam Sofer, you wouldn't be allowed to. How says Ulam? However, Poskim Rabim Bidorenu, Naktu Shemesirat Moda'a Be'erev Rosh Hashanah, Mo'ila Shelo Yachol Neder Mikol Minag Mitzvah Kol Zman Shelo Nadar Beferish Elim Ken Gomar B'Daita. He says there are many poskim who say that as long as you're Moser Moda'a, that you stand before the tribunal on Erev Rosh Hashanah for Hataras Nadarim, and you let them know that you've had a pattern of giving, let's say, of giving 10% of your profits to the poor specifically, and you'd like to change that, then that's acceptable. You're able to do that, unless you had expressed it explicitly. You had stated it explicitly. But if you had never pledged explicitly that your 10% is going to be for the poor, but just that has been your pattern, then that can be something that can be undone through the process on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Kamo shekasavnu le'el v'im kein gam im hifrish laniyim gimel pa'amim lo yachol neder laseis laniyim davka, and therefore that would be one way of solving the issue. Below mashma shach sam sofer diber davka lemishalo masar madai of Rosh Hashanah v'tzarachiyim, and therefore even perhaps the Sam Sofer might agree to that as well. Vihine, he says nowadays, kehayom shenagu latet mikaspei hamaser gam lishar mitzvot, ach b'mikrim bodedim bilvad. He says it seems like the prevailing minhag nowadays, and he's speaking in the late 20th century. He says it seems like the current minhag is to give most of your meiser to the poor, and a little bit of it, in specific instances, you use it for other mitzvahs as well. L'chora kol hamafrish meiser al das haminhag mafrish. It would therefore seem that when you tithe, you're tithing based on the prevailing minhag. Umemela yia mutar lo laseis l'shar mitzvos tahavi kahisna sheyachol laseis l'shar mitzvos. And therefore, today it would seem that you could use your meiser money for other mitzvot other than the poor. V'lichora yeshraya l'sem mitshuvas maharam mirutenberg huva beveis lechem Yehuda al shulchan aruch shenagat the meiser hu laniyim davka mishum shahaminhag latet lahem. And the Maharam mirutenberg, who's one of the Rishonim, says that when you take meiser, you're supposed to give it specifically to the poor, and then he adds the words because that's the minhag. V'im kein mashma midvarav the im hishtane haminhag kamo bizmanenu yemutar latet lishar mitzvot. And therefore, it seems like whenever the minhag has changed in the community, you would be allowed to allocate it to other charitable causes, even if it's not for the poor. So I'm not even going to go to the bottom paragraph because he keeps deliberating backwards and forwards. But the bottom line is that it is considered, I would say, by all accounts, it's considered to be the prevailing minhag nowadays, that when we tithe, it's our tithing is not exclusively for the poor, but it's considered to be for all nonprofit organizations that support Jewish causes. To me, that's what it seems like the prevailing minhag, and it's been that way for at least a generation. And I think that's especially so in the 21st century, in light of the fact that we've done so much better with wealth management as a society. So there are fewer poor people. And so when we talk about tzedakah, let's think about what do we include in tzedakah. We include bikur cholen, of helping people out who might need a hand when they go to the hospital, having access to kosher food. Now, well, Tomchei Shabbos is for the poor. That Tomchei Shabbos is certainly for the poor. But that's why, everything outside of Tomchei Shabbos that we think about supporting in our community. Small Wonders is an organization that helps couples who are seeking infertility treatment. They don't qualify as poor people, but they would like to be able to be fertile. And so there's a mitzvah to support them. Chai Lifeline, Magen David Adom, Hatzalah, Yehuda V'Shomron. Organizations like that, which are charitable organizations, very, very worthy causes, but are not specifically for the sake of helping poor people put food on their table, right? So that's interesting. The Shulchan Aruch itself acknowledges that you're supposed to give a percentage of your tzedakah to non-Jewish causes. And I don't know what, the fact that he hasn't talked about this is probably because he lives in Israel. And so it's not in his radar, it's not within his sights. But yes, b'mipnei darkei shalom, for purposes of maintaining peaceful relations with the non-Jewish world, person is supposed to give a small percentage, a relatively small percentage of his tzedakah money to non-Jewish causes as well. I can tell you, there was one of our children was sick once, and so ever since then, I give regular donations to the children's hospital that helped us and ended up not charging us the full amount. So, I think that there are many reasons beyond even Darkei Shalom for a person to support non-Jewish causes. Yeah. I think it would fall into that category because you're doing something to help society, right? We did years ago, we did the ice bucket challenge, right? So ALS, yeah, to help ALS. Yeah. Okay. Now let's go to the next shiloh. Siman Vav. The intovas hana mikaspe maaser. Benefiting from your tzedakah donations. This is a big issue. In what ways am I or am I not permitted to benefit from my tzedakah donations? What's a classic example? Oh, okay, that's a good one. Sponsoring Kiddush. Well, perhaps getting tax receipts. The one that he's going to deal with now is buying a lottery ticket from your tzedakah money. The Kollel does a regular lottery, and there are a number of organizations that do regular lotteries. So is it permitted? Is there such a thing permitted? Can you buy a lottery ticket for an organization from your Meiser money? I'm sure that the answer is going to be yes, according to some, because otherwise, how else do these organizations do it? But let's try and understand the thinking behind it. Shuva, mutar liknos kartis hagrala mikaspe maaser, keshamit kavein lemitzvat tzedakah, ucheshedemei hakartis holchim lematarat tzedakah la'aniyim. He says it is permitted to buy a lottery ticket from Meiser money if the intent is for the mitzvah of tzedakah. In other words, if you're buying a lottery from a charitable organization, and the proceeds of the lottery ticket are going to the poor. Ulam im zacha bekartis be'eze pras yitachno shnei matzavim. So he says, if you win the lottery, so there are possibly two scenarios. Osha hapras shayach lekona hakartis mishum shehu begeder matana me hamosad l'torim. We have to look at really what the halachic status of that win is. Like when there's the item that you win. Let's say you win a car, okay? You can either look at that car as a gift from that charitable organization to the winner of that lottery, Oshu shayach lemaiser mishum shehu ke'en mechira tmurat hamaaser shekibel hamosad, or that it really is considered to be a something that is subject to tithing, because you've done sort of like a transaction with the Meiser money that you gave to the organization. And therefore, the charitable organization can tell you how they view the car. It's either a gift from the charitable organization, or it's a profit that you receive in a transactional exchange with the organization. What it will be the ramification? Well, we'll have to see. So let's take a look. So he says, "B'shulchan aruch kosav v'zel lashono. Ha'omer zela zu litzdaka v'hifrisho ad shelo ba li yad hagabay yachol l'shanoso." The Shulchan Aruch paskins that if a person puts aside a coin and he says this is going for tzedakah, and then there are multiple aniyim, right? That this money could go to. He is, until it gets to the hands of the gabbai, you're allowed to use that money for personal use. until such time that you choose to give it to the tzedakah collector. So therefore, bein lelavoso la'atzmo, bein lelavoso lechaver. You can even borrow that money temporarily to use it for paying someone, or you could lend it out to a friend. But then you have to replace it. In other words, you set aside $20 for tzedakah, but then you said, you know what? I just realized I need cash to pay the gardener, right? And so you say, okay, I'll owe the $20 to tzedakah. That's perfectly legitimate. You're allowed to do that. The yifra acher tachtav, and you're allowed to replace therefore the $20 later on. But mishabali ad gabai asur lilvoso, bein lo, bein la'acher, bein lagabai ad kan l'sham. But once it's come into the hands of the tzedakah, then no party is allowed to use it for any purpose other than for the charity. So I can't, once I've given it to the tzedakah collector, I can't say, do you mind giving that back to me? I need it to pay my garden. I'm not allowed to do that. So one thing that is clear is that you're allowed to borrow from tzedakah money that you yourself set aside. And you can use it temporarily for other purposes, provided that you replenish those funds and eventually give that money for tzedakah. So where are we going with this? Where are we going with this? So he says, "Uvenidon dinan yesh lechalek bein ha'ofanim." He says, and in our situation, in our question that we've raised, buying a lottery ticket, he says the circumstances will change. He says, "She'im misha kone kartis hagrala mimaiser ksafim, eno miskavein letoeles litzdaka v'la'aniyim klal, ela litzarech atzma." He says, what if a person purchases a lottery ticket and his primary concern is to win the lottery? He doesn't really care about the charity. So that's a possible scenario. It's like a free, get a free trip for two to Israel. And he says, I've always wanted to go to Israel. I really hope I win the lottery. And it's only $100. So why not? Not a major investment. Maybe I'll win. So he says, in that kind of situation, so he's taking his meiser money, because he says, I have $100 from my meiser money, and instead of just donating it, I'll buy a lottery ticket. So I'm sort of lending myself the money. One way of looking at it is I'm lending myself the money before I make it a complete charitable donation. And I'm basically stipulating that if I win the lottery, so then I guess I'll owe the extra $100 to the charity, right? But at the end of the day, if I don't win the lottery, then it's sort of like I'm reimbursing the tzedakah. So I'm sort of temporarily using it for my own benefit in the hopes of winning the lottery. So that's something we'll have to look at in just a moment. But this is even before that. Before we even get to what's the status of the proceeds, which we saw up above, the question first is it even permitted, if my objective is primarily for myself, to use my tzedakah money for that purpose? So if you end up winning the lottery and you end up, let's say it's a cash prize, so then you'll have to pay back the $100 to your meiser tithe. But if he doesn't have that mental sort of acknowledgement that what he's doing is borrowing from his meiser money, then there may be even the possibility of stealing from his meiser. That's something that he's already allocated for tzedakah, unless he recognizes that he's really borrowing temporarily from his meiser account. There could be problems. Ulam, mashamatzoi bizmanenu v'zen nidon b'simen zeh u'shemiskavein gam lemitzvas tzedakah. He says, so that's not really the normal situation. If a person were, let's say, to borrow from his Meiser account, his Meiser money, to buy a lottery that's not linked with a charitable organization, so then that's clearly borrowing from your Meiser money, and that's fine. But that's really not the case that we're dealing with. What we're dealing with is where the donor has full intent that this should be a charitable donation, whether or not he wins the lottery. Because the organization that's setting up the lottery is taking the money for charity. The only thing is that in order for him to, if he should win the lottery, in order for that to be legitimate, the money that he's shelling out for the lottery ticket has to belong to him and not be already segregated for Meiser. So the concern is, maybe I'm stealing from my Meiser account, because once I've set it aside that it's for tzedakah, I'm not allowed to touch it, unless I have in mind that I'm borrowing the money for personal use. So that's really sort of the confusing aspect of this, is that since I'm giving it to a charitable organization, it seems from that that I'm not taking it for personal use. I'm giving it to the charity. But on the other hand, if I win the lottery, the only way I can win the lottery is if the money that I invested was my money and not the charity's money. And therefore, we have to figure out what mechanism we're using in order to allow a person to buy a lottery ticket for a charity. So he says, "V'hinei hataz kosav shemuta liknos la'achar aliyah l'Torah mikasbei meiser." So the Taz says something interesting, that you're allowed to purchase for another person to buy him an aliyah in the shul, and you can use your meiser money. Now remember, the Taz was of the opinion that meiser should only go to the poor. So how do we reconcile that? V'lomad zos mimasha matzanu lehedja shetovas hana b'meiser ani muteres. Apparently, the Taz is talking about a case where you're buying an aliyah for a poor person, and that's considered to be tzedakah, and tzedakah for the poor, because maybe the guy himself wouldn't be able to afford it. And the Taz says you can decide to do with your tzedakah money for the poor whatever you want to. In kain muchach she'efshar lasus kinyan b'kesef meiser. So therefore, you see from there that you're allowed to affect a transaction with your tzedakah money. V'yesh lidchos shemikiven shataz diber ba'ofen shakesef holech la'aniyim kimivur b'taz atzmo. He says no. He says the Taz is talking about a case where what does the shul do with the money that they collect for the aliyah? They give it to the poor. They don't give it to the shul. And that's the rationale. Im kain ein kan mechira amitis alanostim haliyah l'Torah l'misha moser hamaiser shalom. But rather, it's really not a transaction, but rather the shul awards an aliyah to someone who gives tzedakah to the poor. It's basically a gift, or sort of a gratitude gift to anyone who will donate through the shul's charity fund to the poor. You'll get recognition in the shul. They'll give you an aliyah. So that's the way the Taz is looking at it. So it's not a transaction. It's not like you're purchasing an aliyah over there. You're giving the money for the poor, and the shul, in gratitude, gives you a gift. So, v'gam b'nidon didan yesh lomar shahamoisad noten zuchut lahagrala lemisha noten lo tzedakah ve'ein ze begeder mechira ela begeder matana l'Torah. Umimela ein kan hishtamshut b'meiser b'toras gezel ela hana'a mikasbei meiser b'lvado mutar. So it would turn out that if we wanted to look at it at a lottery purchase from that perspective, we could say that it's not a transaction. When I buy a lottery ticket, it's not like I'm purchasing a trip to Israel at a discount, but rather I'm giving the money outright to charity. And if I win the lottery, it's that the charitable organization is awarding me in gratitude a gift. They can only give the gift to one person, so they do a lottery to see who they're going to award the gift to. But really, the gift is not linked to that money that I gave to the charity. So that's the other way of looking at it. And then there wouldn't be any question about taking something unfairly from my tzedakah account. Okay, so I think we're going to hold it here. And when we commence, because it seems clear that you're allowed to, maybe we'll see in the next tshuva what I have to do if I get a cash prize from a lottery, how I'm supposed to tithe that. It would seem pretty clear that that's considered to be earnings. And I would have to, because you're supposed to take Meiser even from a gift, right? So we'll see how that plays itself out next time. We won't be meeting at all next week because I'll be out of town. And then we'll commence